Trump, Venezuela and Maduro. The operation that shocked the world. Part 1. January 20th, 2017. Donald Trump became president. Within hours, his team was already planning something unprecedented. Something that would reshape Latin American politics. Something that would bring two nations to the brink of war. The target? Nicolas Maduro, the socialist dictator of Venezuela. Venezuela was dying. Once the richest country in South America, now a catastrophe. Hyperinflation reaching 1,000,000%. Food shortages, medicine shortages, millions fleeing as refugees, a humanitarian crisis on a biblical scale. And at the center of it all sat Nicolas Maduro, Hugo Chávez's hand-picked successor, a former bus driver turned authoritarian ruler, clinging to power through fraud, violence, and Cuban intelligence support. Most presidents would have issued statements,
Imposait sanctions.
made diplomatic noise. Trump had a different idea, a dangerous idea, an idea that would shock the world. He wanted regime change, not eventually, now. Maduro has to go, Trump told his advisors in early 2017. How do we make that happen? This decision would have irreversible consequences, because what Trump was proposing wasn't just sanctions, not just diplomatic pressure. He was asking about military options, covert operations, direct action, the kind of interventions that had defined American foreign policy in Latin America for decades, the kind that usually ended in disaster. His advisors were split. John Bolton, the national security advisor, was enthusiastic. Bolton had spent his career advocating for regime change. Iraq,
Iran.
North Korea, now Venezuela. Maximum pressure, Bolton urged. Maduro is vulnerable. We can topple him. But others were cautious. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State. James Mattis, the Defense Secretary. They'd seen interventions go wrong.
Vietnam.
Iraq,
Afghanistan.
Libya. American history was littered with regime change operations that created more problems than they solved. Trump didn't care about history. He cared about winning. And in his mind, removing Maduro would be a win. For America, for Venezuela, for his own legacy. A socialist dictator toppled. Democracy restored. Refugees returning home. Oil flowing again. It was perfect. But what nobody expected was how close Trump would come to actually doing it. August 2017. A meeting in the Oval Office. Trump's national security team assembled. The topic, Venezuela. Trump's question, can we invade? The room went silent. Invade? As in send American troops? As in start a war? Mr. President, Mattis said carefully, a military invasion of Venezuela would be extremely costly, politically, diplomatically, militarily. The casualties could be significant. Trump wasn't interested in caution. But could we win? Yes, sir. Of course we could win. But then why aren't we doing it? This was classic Trump. Impatient with process. Uninterested in consequences. Focused only on the outcome. Maduro gone. Trump victorious. The details were someone else's problem. His advisors pushed back. Gently at first, then more forcefully. An invasion would unite Latin America against the United States. Would validate every anti-American conspiracy. Would create a refugee crisis. Would cost billions. Would require years of occupation. Trump was frustrated. So what do we do? Just let Maduro stay in power? Let Venezuela collapse? We use sanctions, Mr. President. Economic pressure. Diplomatic isolation. Support the opposition. It takes time, but I don't have time, Trump interrupted. I want results. Now. That moment changed everything. Because Trump's team realized they couldn't give him an invasion. Congress would never approve it. The public would oppose it. Latin America would explode. But they needed to give him something. Some action. Some victory. Something that looked tough. Felt decisive. Made Trump happy. So they developed a plan. Not invasion, but intervention. Covert. Deniable. Aggressive. The plan had several components. First, recognize the opposition. When Maduro inevitably rigged the next election, the U.S. would recognize the opposition leader as the legitimate president. Not just diplomatically, legally, officially. Second, freeze Venezuelan assets. Billions in oil revenue, bank accounts, investments, all frozen. Deny Maduro the money he needed to pay the military, to import food, to maintain power. Third, build an international coalition. Get other countries to recognize the opposition. Impose their own sanctions. Isolate Maduro completely. Fourth, and this is where it got dangerous, support the opposition. Not just diplomatically, materially, intelligence, communications equipment, maybe more. Trump liked the plan. It was aggressive. It made him look tough. It didn't require congressional approval. Perfect. But the plan had a problem. It assumed the Venezuelan opposition was competent, united, ready to seize power. They weren't. January 2019. The plan launched. Juan Guaidó, the leader of Venezuela's National Assembly, declared himself interim president. Within hours, the United States recognized him. Within days, 50 countries followed. Maduro woke up to find that half the world considered him illegitimate. His assets frozen. His international support crumbling. The pressure was immense. This should have been his end. But what nobody expected was how resilient Maduro would prove to be. At that moment, everything changed. Because Maduro had something Trump's team hadn't fully appreciated. Cuban intelligence, Russian support, Chinese money, and most importantly, control of the military. The Venezuelan military was the key. If they defected, Maduro was finished. If they stayed loyal, Guaidó was just a guy making speeches. Everything depended on the generals. Trump's team worked to flip them. Secret meetings, promises of immunity, offers of money, appeals to patriotism. They came close. Several high-ranking officers indicated willingness to switch sides. But then Maduro's Cuban advisors intervened. They identified the potential defectors, arrested some, bought others, intimidated the rest. The planned military uprising never materialized. Guaidó stood in the streets, declared himself president, waited for the military to join him. They didn't. He looked foolish, impotent. The momentum was lost. Trump was furious. "I thought you said this would work." His advisors scrambled. They needed a new plan, something bolder, something that would force Maduro out. Part 2. April 30th, 2019. Operation Freedom. Guaidó's last gamble. Coordinated uprising. Military defections. Street protests. The final push to remove Maduro. The plan was audacious. Guaidó would appear at a military base with defecting soldiers. Show that the military was switching sides. Trigger a cascade of defections. Overwhelm Maduro's security forces through sheer numbers. American intelligence was deeply involved. Not officially, not publicly, but the CIA was providing information, communications support, coordination. This was the covert intervention Trump had wanted. Early morning, Guaidó appeared at La Carlota Air Base in Caracas. Surrounded by soldiers, flanked by military vehicles, he addressed the nation. "Today, the armed forces have decided to stand with the people." It looked impressive, revolutionary, historic, the moment Venezuela had been waiting for. But what nobody knew was that it was all theater. The soldiers with Guaidó weren't an army. They were a handful of defectors, maybe 30, maybe 40. The military vehicles were symbolic. The show of force was an illusion. Guaidó was betting that the appearance of a coup would trigger an actual coup. It didn't work. Maduro's forces surrounded the base, blocked the exits, waited. No cascade of defections came. No mass uprising materialized. By afternoon, it was clear. Operation Freedom had failed. Guaidó's supporters fled. Some sought asylum in embassies. Others went into hiding. The Venezuelan opposition was shattered, demoralized, defeated. Trump watched from Washington, seething. He'd been promised regime change, guaranteed success. Now he looked weak, like he'd backed a loser. "This is unacceptable," Trump told Bolton. "We need to do something. Something dramatic." Bolton saw his opening. For years, he'd wanted to use American military power more aggressively. Now Trump was angry enough to consider it. "Mr. President, we could conduct a limited military strike. Destroy Maduro's military capabilities. Show him we're serious." Trump was intrigued. What kind of strike? Precision bombing. Take out his air force, his command centers, his intelligence facilities. Quick, surgical. Send a message. For several days in May 2019, the United States came closer to war with Venezuela than most people realize. Trump authorized military planning. Assets were moved. Options were prepared. The Pentagon drew up target lists. But then something unexpected happened. The international reaction was immediate and negative. Brazil opposed military action.
Colombia restrant.
Even allies who'd recognized Guaido warned against invasion. More importantly, Maduro called Trump's bluff. Instead of escalating, he de-escalated, offered negotiations, appeared reasonable, put Trump in a position where attacking would make America look like the aggressor. Trump blinked. The strikes were called off. The military option was shelved. Not permanently, but for now. At that moment, everything changed, because both sides learned important lessons. Trump learned that regime change is harder than it looks, that you can't just will a dictator out of power, that even incompetent authoritarians can survive if they control the military and have foreign backing. Maduro learned that Trump was all bark and no bite, that the threats of military action were empty, that he could survive American pressure if he was strategic, if he was patient, if he played his cards right. The stalemate hardened. Guaido remained in Venezuela, claiming to be president. Maduro remained in the palace, actually being president. The international community was split. America and its allies recognized Guaido. Russia, China, Cuba, and others recognized Maduro. Venezuela became a frozen conflict. Neither side strong enough to win. Neither side willing to compromise. But Trump wasn't done trying. If military force was off the table, he'd try something else. Something unconventional. Something that would make headlines and shock the world. May 2020. The Bay of Piglets. No, that's not a typo. That's what it became known as. A pathetic echo of the Bay of Pigs. Cuba. 1961. But somehow worse. Here's what happened. A group of mercenaries, led by former American Special Forces soldiers, attempted to invade Venezuela by boat, with the goal of capturing Maduro and bringing him to the United States. It was insane, suicidal, doomed from the start. But it happened. The operation was called Gideon, organized by a private military company called Silvercorp USA, led by Jordan Goudreau, a former Green Beret, funded by allegedly Venezuelan opposition figures, with the goal of overthrowing Maduro. The plan was simple: infiltrate by sea, link up with Venezuelan military defectors, launch a lightning strike on Caracas, capture Maduro, extract him, deliver him to American authorities. Sounded like a bad action movie. It was worse than that. May 3rd, 2020. 2 boats carrying mercenaries left from Colombia, heading for the Venezuelan coast, armed with rifles, radios, and apparently no intelligence whatsoever. Venezuelan security forces were waiting. They'd been tipped off, possibly by Cuban intelligence, possibly by infiltrators in the opposition. The boats were intercepted almost immediately. 8 mercenaries killed, dozens captured, including 2 American citizens, former Green Berets, who were paraded on Venezuelan state television, confessing, claiming they were working for Trump. The fallout was spectacular. Venezuela accused the United States of attempting a military coup, showed the captured Americans as proof, demanded international condemnation. The Trump administration denied everything. "We have nothing to do with this," Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared. This was not a U.S. government operation. Technically true, but deeply misleading, because while the U.S. government didn't organize the operation, American officials had known about it, had met with Goudreau, had listened to his plans, and at minimum hadn't stopped it, at maximum had quietly encouraged it. Trump himself later suggested he knew nothing. "I'll let you know if we do something to Venezuela," he said. "We're not involved in that at all." But what nobody expected was what came next. This decision would have irreversible consequences. Part 3. The captured Americans sat in Venezuelan prisons. Bargaining chips. Human leverage. Maduro had exactly what he wanted. Proof of American aggression. Evidence to show his supporters. Ammunition for his propaganda. For Trump, it was a disaster. Americans captured in a failed operation he'd allegedly known nothing about. Mercenaries claiming they had a contract signed by Juan Guaido. The whole thing was an embarrassment. But behind the scenes, something more interesting was happening. Something that would reveal the complexity of Trump's Venezuela strategy. Because while publicly denying involvement, Trump's team was quietly negotiating. Not for regime change anymore, for something more practical. A deal. Here's what few people understood. Trump didn't actually care about democracy in Venezuela. He cared about winning, about looking strong, about getting credit. If Maduro would give him something he could call a victory, Trump would take it. The negotiations were secret, indirect, using intermediaries. Neither side wanted to be seen talking to the other. But talks were happening. What did Trump want? The American prisoners released. Oil flowing again. Refugees stopped. The crisis contained. Something he could tout as success. What did Maduro want?
Sanctions lifted.
Assets unfrozen. International recognition. Trump to stop backing Guaido. The gulf was wide, but not unbridgeable. Both sides had incentives to deal. Then COVID hit. The pandemic changed everything. Trump's attention shifted. Venezuela fell down the priority list. The negotiations stalled. But the relationship between Trump and Maduro became something strange. Almost personal. They'd never met. Probably never would. But they were locked in this bizarre dance. Each trying to outmaneuver the other. Each claiming victory. Neither actually winning. Trump would announce new sanctions. Maduro would denounce American imperialism. Trump would threaten military action. Maduro would call it bluster. Round and round they went. Meanwhile, Venezuela continued to collapse. By 2020, 7 million Venezuelans had fled. 20% of the population. The largest refugee crisis in Western Hemisphere history. Hyperinflation continued. Food shortages worsened. The healthcare system collapsed entirely. And Maduro remained in power. Weakened. Isolated. Struggling. But in power. Trump's Venezuela policy had failed. Completely. He'd thrown everything at Maduro.
Sanctions.
Diplomatic pressure. Covert operations. Support for the opposition. Threats of military action. None of it worked. Why? Several reasons. First, Maduro had powerful allies. Cuba provided intelligence and security expertise. Russia provided military support. China provided money. As long as Maduro had external lifelines, he could survive internal pressure. Second, the Venezuelan military stayed loyal. Not because they loved Maduro, but because defection was risky. Maduro controlled the security apparatus. Cuban advisors monitored everything. Defecting meant death. Staying loyal meant survival. Third, the opposition was weak. Divided. Incompetent. Guaido talked tough but had no real power. No control over territory. No command of forces. No ability to actually govern. Fourth, and most importantly, Trump wasn't willing to actually invade. Everything else was just pressure. Just theater. And Maduro knew it. He called the bluff. And survived. But the story doesn't end with Trump leaving office. Because the operation that shocked the world wasn't just about regime change. It was about reshaping American policy toward Latin America. And that legacy would continue. January 2021. Biden became president. His team inherited Trump's Venezuela mess. The frozen conflict, the humanitarian crisis, the policy failure. Biden's approach was different, more multilateral, more diplomatic, less aggressive. He opened channels to Maduro, discussed limited sanctions relief in exchange for electoral reforms. Maduro played along, made promises, held talks, then held another rigged election. Nothing changed. But here's what's shocking. Despite everything, despite the failure, despite the disaster, despite the embarrassment, Trump's Venezuela policy became bipartisan consensus. Both parties now agree Maduro is illegitimate. Both support sanctions. Both recognize the opposition. Both refuse to normalize relations. Trump's maximalist approach became mainstream. Why? Because backing down would mean admitting failure. No politician wants that. So the policy continues. The sanctions remain. The suffering intensifies. And Maduro? Still in power. Still weak. Still struggling. Still surviving. At that moment, everything changed. Because what Trump's Venezuela operation proved was something dark about American foreign policy. We're great at destroying governments, terrible at replacing them, excellent at imposing costs, awful at creating solutions. Iraq,
Afghanistan,
Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Haiti. The list goes on. Countries where American intervention, whether military or economic, created chaos without creating stability. Venezuela is just the latest example. Trump thought he could remove Maduro easily, quickly, cleanly. He was wrong. But instead of learning from the failure, American policy doubled down. The operation that shocked the world wasn't the Bay of Piglets, wasn't the recognition of Guaido, wasn't the threats of invasion. It was the stubborn refusal to admit that the entire approach wasn't working. Today, Venezuela remains in crisis. Maduro remains in power. The opposition is scattered. The refugees continue fleeing. The humanitarian catastrophe worsens. And American policy, unchanged, because changing it would require admitting Trump was wrong. That maximum pressure failed. That regime change doesn't work. That authoritarians can survive if they're ruthless enough and have powerful enough friends. Nobody wants to admit that, so the fiction continues. Guaido is still recognized by some countries as president, even though he has no power, no legitimacy, no path to actual governance. Maduro is still sanctioned, still isolated, still condemned, even though it clearly isn't working, even though the people suffering most are ordinary Venezuelans, not the regime. This decision would have irreversible consequences, because the real shock isn't what Trump did to Venezuela. It's what Venezuela revealed about Trump, about America, about the limits of power. Trump came into office promising to win, to dominate, to bend the world to his will. Venezuela was supposed to be easy, a socialist dictatorship on America's doorstep, collapsing from its own incompetence, ripe for the taking. Instead, it became a humiliation, a years-long failure, a demonstration that threats without follow-through are meaningless, that economic pressure alone can't topple determined authoritarians, that regime change requires more than just will. It requires strategy, patience, competence. Trump had will, but not the rest, and so Maduro survived, against all odds, against the world's most powerful country, against crippling sanctions, against international isolation, against his own incompetence. He survived because Trump blinked, because invasion was too costly, because the alternatives didn't work, because sometimes the bad guys win. That's the operation that shocked the world. Not a dramatic military intervention, not a successful coup, but a slow-motion failure, a case study in the limits of American power, a demonstration that in the 21st century, even superpowers can't always get what they want. Trump wanted Maduro gone. Maduro is still there. Trump wanted Venezuela stabilized. It's more unstable than ever. Trump wanted to look strong. He looked impotent. And the worst part? There's no good solution, no clean exit, no way to declare victory and move on. The policy failed. But changing it means admitting failure. So it continues. A zombie policy, dead but still walking. This is Trump's Venezuela legacy. Not triumph, not transformation, just tragedy. For Venezuela, for America, for everyone caught in between. The operation that shocked the world wasn't what Trump did. It was what he couldn't do. And what that reveals about the future of American power in a world where economic pressure isn't enough and military force is too much. Maduro won, not because he's strong, but because Trump's tools were inadequate. And that's the most shocking revelation of all.